I did not interview men for the first 4 years of my study. And it wasn't until a man looked at me one day after a book signing and said, "I love what you have to say about shame. I'm curious why you didn't mention men." And I said, "I don't study men." And he said, "That's convenient." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you say to reach out, tell our story, be vulnerable. But you see those books you just signed for my wife and my 3 daughters?" I said, "Yeah. They'd rather me die on top of my white horse than watch me fall down." When we reach out and be vulnerable, we get the shit beat out of us. And don't tell me it's from the guys and the coaches and the dads. Because the women in my life are harder on me than anyone else.
You ever ask a man how he's doing and he says, "I'm alright"? I'm here to tell you, that man is not alright. That man is battling demons that you cannot even possibly imagine. That man is struggling every single day to find a reason to keep going. And the reason we say we're alright is because that's what you're going through. So why even bother to say it?
Men are so sick and fed up from the last 20 years of being shamed for being men and having women be like, "You have all these privileges, you should know your privilege." And all. What privilege? I did what a man has to do, which is I took care of my mother. I faced the loneliest, darkest nights. Look, majority of suicides are men. Majority of mental health issues are men. It's so scary, it's so tough. It's such a journey you have to go through. As a man, it's a tough existence.
For a fact. If you're a man, then it's absolutely an utterly different experience of life. I think we're here to struggle. I think we're here to endure pain. Yeah. I think we're here to just see how hard we are to kill. I think that going through terrible things and living through them and coming out the other side is one of the most fantastic things about being human. I think that it's almost like once you understand what life is really about, there's no emotion which isn't enjoyable. The only emotional state which can be seen as detrimental is feeling nothing at all. But if you're sitting at home and you're feeling truly heartbroken, at least you're feeling something, right? And I think that's the whole part of being human. I think we're here to struggle. I think we're here to go through pain. That's I wake up each day and go, what can I attack? What problem can I solve?
You say we have no emotions, you haven't got a clue. We got emotions you never even saw. We got screams you haven't heard. We got poetry that's never been written. We've got love shut up in our hearts and in our minds and in our guts, our bowels, our loins that never reaches you. Because you cannot hear the language we speak.
If all of the oxygen were sucked out of this room right now, all of us would see how important it is, but we do not see oxygen. Tonight, I want to tell you a story of a man who lived long enough to know that what was unseen and important, that is his inner life, the life of what the Greeks called the psyche, or the soul, that though so important to him, this life was neglected, terribly neglected. Neglected by his spouse, neglected by the larger society, and neglected to such a degree that it led him on more than one occasion to the point of considering taking his own life. As you listen to the story of this man, I want you to think very carefully about the men in your lives. I want you to think about your fathers. I want you to think about your husbands. I want you to think about your brothers, your uncles, and your nephews. This man begins his life in a household that some might rightly call hyper-masculine. He grows up, the youngest of 7 children, in a home with 3 brothers and 3 3 sisters. He affectionately calls himself the tiebreaker. And growing up in a household with a father and 3 brothers was sort of like growing up with 4 fathers. And growing up in a household with a mother and 3 sisters was sort of like growing up with 4 mothers. And this household was, by today's standards, I would venture to say, rather chauvinistic. The men had more important things to do than cook or clean. After all, the men had to watch football on Sunday. And as this man's father saw it, it was the task of the women to tend to the men and make sure that they had food to eat while they watched the game. And one of the cardinal rules in this man's household was that men were never supposed to cry. Men were never supposed to show emotion. Men were never supposed to cry or show emotion, because to do so was to demonstrate to the rest of the world, which, by the way, was always out to get you, that you were weak somehow. And in a strange sort of way, this man grew up in a household where he never once saw his father cry. Now, as he grew up and moved through high school, this hyper-masculine mentality sort of served him well. He excelled on the football team in high school and bears the distinction to this day of being the only male in his family who played on a football team that actually won a league championship. And through all of the challenging practices in the hot summer sun before the season started, and through all of the bumps and bruises of playing football in high school, his father's advice and the advice of his brothers served him well. Ignore how you feel, even when it hurts. On the football field, this works nicely, because it means you're tough. It means you're a team player. And so his ethics, his value system of being tough served him well through his adolescent years, through college, and then he got married. And when he got married, he carried his ideas of masculinity with him into the marriage. When he got married, he noticed that his spouse seemed preoccupied with his physical appearance. And from time to time, she would comment on how displeasing it was to her. And she would comment on how unattractive he was to her in the most intimate of ways. She would remark to him about how other men who she knew in the past that she never even considered dating, let alone marrying, were far more attractive than he was. But because he had always been taught to ignore how he felt, he kept going. And it was just like the bumps and bruises that you experience on the football field. Your leg may hurt, but you keep playing because you have to take it for the team. You have to be a team player. And so he ignored the way he felt, and he kept going. And not long into his marriage, he began to see very clearly that his feelings of inadequacy and a profound sense of worthlessness began to affect him deeply. And he started to experience intense bouts of depression. But he was always told to ignore how he felt. He was always told not to cry, for to cry would make him less of a man. In fact, he was told men don't even talk about things like thoughts or feelings. And this pattern continued throughout his marriage to the point where every 6 months to a year, he could, with some accuracy, pinpoint the moment in time when he would be confronted with an episode of rage and hostility about what he looked like and how unattractive he was to his spouse. He continued and persisted, always ignoring how he felt, until one day, the hostility and anger that confronted him reached crisis proportions, as his spouse committed what some would suggest was the ultimate act of betrayal in withdrawing completely from the physical side of the relationship and unilaterally declaring celibacy until such time as he made himself more attractive for her. Now his feelings of worthlessness have reached a boiling point, and now he begins to reach out for help. And for the first time, about 3 years ago, this man in our story begins to run internet searches about how he's feeling. He couldn't talk about it because his father's voice still echoed from his grave. Men don't talk about things like that. And as he typed in the Google search field, feelings of worthlessness, sadness, depression, he came across a definition of emotional abuse. And the definition of emotional abuse that he found was an ongoing process where one person systematically diminishes, then destroys the inner life of another. Remember how we inhabit two worlds? One outer and external and seen, and the other internal and unseen? He realizes now that he has a name for how he's feeling. And then he looks up the symptoms. And chief among the symptoms of emotional abuse is a fixation of the abuser on some physical characteristic of the abused. And it says that this fixation may persist in the worst cases for decades. And as he thought about it and as he reflected on it, he came to understand that her persistent demands for him to lose weight and change his appearance to make himself more attractive bore the hallmark symptom of emotional abuse. He then came across others which were menacing tones and looks, and he realized that recently the anger and hostility had been ratcheted up to a level that he had never seen before. And so now he sees multiple symptoms of emotional abuse and he's in crisis. So he reaches out. And one of the first places he reaches out to is his church. And he discovers quite tragically that his church is woefully unprepared to deal with abusive situations in terms of emotional abuse in marriages. Now, for the first time, he understands what he heard all of the women in his church say for decades, which was, I'm in an abusive relationship and the church can't help me. Now, for the first time, this man who had been taught his entire life to ignore the way he felt, he understood the plight of women in a way that he had never understood before. All his church could do was tell him to stay married and work it out. And then, Fortunately for him, there was one small church about 2.5 hours south of where he lived that provided him a place through a small men's group to share how he was feeling. And he discovered that he was far from being the only one who experienced what he had been experiencing for so long. In fact, as he engaged other men in conversation, he realized that their inner lives had been disregarded as well. Since then, no less than 5 or 6 men have come up to him and said, "Every time you tell me what happened to you, I'm thoroughly convinced that you are telling my story." He got to a place where he thought that his only way out, having turned to his church for help, having turned to certain male friends for help and being disappointed, he got to a place where the only thing he thought he could do to relieve himself of this pain was to end his life. And on more than one occasion, hatched a plot to do exactly that. He sought a clinical intervention and was talked off of the proverbial ledge. And now, this man is at a much better place. As this man has talked about his story with other men, they have, as I said a moment ago, said to him, "You're telling my story." I want to take you back to your fathers, to your husbands, to your uncles, to your brothers, and to your nephews. And I have a sense that as I talk and deliver these words to you tonight, I'm probably telling some of their stories too. I know the man in our story quite well. That man is me. I hope that as a result of something I've said tonight, someone, some man, somewhere, somehow, some way, will cease to suffer in silence because someone has listened in a way that has allowed them to be touched by the story, not necessarily of themselves, but by the story of the men or man in your life. The aim of tonight's talk is to raise awareness and to bring attention to what is so often neglected. That is to say, to the inner life of a human being. I'm confident that if we give the inner life of a human being this sort of attention, that men and women will no longer have to suffer in silence.
I want to say something to my sisters, and I want you to understand me well. The enemy does want to bind you. He does want to bind you. But I want to tell you something, sisters. The enemy really isn't after you. He really isn't after you. He wants to bind you, but he doesn't have to worry about killing you. You remember when David came down to Ziklag and the women were taken into captivity and the men had to go get the women and get them out. David was really the first one to preach women are loose. When he brought those women out of captivity, encouraged himself in the Lord and saw them transform, that was women are loose. They didn't kill the women, they trapped them. And all through the Bible talks about women being trapped, talks about silly women being trapped, because the enemy wants to trap women, but he wants to kill men. So to the woman, we are talking about woman thou art loose, but when it comes to the man, we are fighting for our lives because the devil wants to kill men. You know why? I want you to understand what's going on, sister. The enemy knows that if he kills your man, or your son, or your father, he doesn't have to kill you. You'll spend the rest of your life with your heart broken over who fell apart, who didn't love you, who didn't raise you, who didn't turn out like you thought, who wasn't there for you. He'll break your heart with what he does to your son and what happened to your father or what happened to your husband or your boyfriend, and he'll break your back as you carry weight that you were never built to carry because you had no man to stand by your side. And he'll seek to terminate and destroy the life of men because he knows he gets 2 for 1. When he gets the man, he gets you too. That's why in the book, in the Bible, it talks about in the King James Version to destroy everyone that pisses against the wall. It means to destroy everything that stands up when it urinates. The devil is after men. That's why when Moses was born, there was a decree made by Pharaoh to destroy every male child under 2 years old. He didn't wait till they got old. He started out early wanting to kill them lest they become kings and giants and enter into their destiny. Men are on the hit list of hell. That's why when the baby Jesus was born, Joseph had to take him down into Egypt and hide him for 2 years because Satan had a contract out for men and he was willing to kill every male child until he got to that child, because the prophecy in the book of Genesis said that the seed of the woman would rise up and bruise the head of the seed of the serpent. My sister, he's not after you, he's after your seed. Well, what seed does a woman have? The woman's seed is her son. The prophecy is in the male child. The Hebrew word zerah. He wants to kill your seed, your son, your father, the masculine voice in your house. He's after the male child. After the male child.
The castle in which I live, my rescuing night. My God, the high crag, where I run for dear life, hiding behind the boulders, safe in the granite hideout. I sing to God, the praise lofty, and find myself safe and saved. The hangman's noose was tied at my throat. Devil waters rushed over me. Hell's ropes cinched me tight. Death traps barred at every exit. A hostile world. But I call to God. I cry to God to help me. From his palace he hears my call. My cry brings me right into his presence. A private audience. See, he caught me and reached all the way from sky to sea. He pulled me out of that ocean of hate, that enemy of chaos. The void in which I was drowning, they hit me when I was down, but God stuck by me. He stood me up on a wide open field, and I stood there saved, surprised to be loved. God made my life complete when I placed all the pieces before him. When I got my act together, he gave me a fresh start. Now I'm alert to God's ways. I don't take God for granted. Every day I review the ways he works. I try not to miss anything. I feel put back together, and I'm watching my step. God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to his eyes. Suddenly, God, you floodlight my life. I'm blazing with glory, God's glory. I smash the bands of the marauders. I vault the highest fences. What a God. His road stretches straight and smooth. Every God direction is road tested. Everyone who runs towards him makes it. I run to you. So you came and changed my life. You thought I was worth keeping. So you cleaned me up inside. You thought I was to die for. So you sacrificed your life so I could be free, so I could be whole, and I could tell everyone I know. So you thought I was worth. So you came. You thought I was worth it. So you cleaned me up inside. You thought I was to die for. So you sacrificed your life so I could be free. Whole. Everyone, you thought I was worth. So you came. You thought I was worth keeping. So you cleaned me up and you thought I was to die for. You sacrificed your life so I could be free. Oh, come on. You thought I was worth saving. So you came. You thought I was worth keeping. So you cleaned me up and you thought I was to die for. So you sacrificed, hallelujah, so I could be free, so I could be whole, and I could tell everyone, one more time, you thought I saved it. So you